right. Hi, everybody. Here we are going live. Jack Gorsline or Gorsline?
Gorsline.
Gorsline, great. And
Yep.
Joe Moore from Psychedelics Today. We are here to talk about some interesting stories happening in psychedelics and cannabis. Jack is a journalist living in the Boston area. And are you in Boston proper?
Yes. Yeah. Right in the heart of Southie. For those who don't know, that's kind of like I'm kind of on the set of Good Will Hunting for reference.
Your accent's too clean. Um,
Yeah, I'm a Southern transplant, born and raised in Richmond, Virginia.
Right on. Great.
Yep.
So we started chatting maybe, I don't know, about a year ago, maybe a little less, and very excited to have you on because you've been doing some, good work. You've been getting really passionate about stories and getting the word out about things that have been going on in the psychedelic and cannabis ecosystems. And um, it seems like there are not yet enough people writing and doing good journalism on these topics. I'm happy you're doing it.
Yeah. Thank you. No, I really appreciate it, Joe. And you were an early champion of some of my early scribblings here in Massachusetts, covering the early days of the Question 4 campaign, and your support for the idea and the concept of a psychedelic writers guild, which we'll get into later. It has been, tremendously important, and I very much appreciate, all that you've done, to amplify my work. Yeah, no, it's an honor to be here.
Great. Yeah. Happy to have you, Jack. And so today we're going to talk about a number of things, some things going on in Connecticut that are really interesting, an update on DOI and DOC. I hope we get a chance to talk about some of the after story of the Question 4 in Massachusetts campaign, which was the Massachusetts legalization campaign. And for
Hmm.
those tuning in, feel free to drop some questions in, comments in, and we'll, if they work, we'll try to read them and respond. And I'll try to remind you all a few times about that as well. So, what story do we want to start with, Jack?
Well, I would love to start with kind of what's hottest off the press out of New York State, that came in last night by way of some folks affiliated with New Yorkers for Mental Health Alternatives. I actually just got off the phone with New Yorkers for Mental Health Alternative co-founder Avery Stemple a little while ago, with the hottest goss, I guess. They had a really successful and seemingly fruitful lobbying day earlier this month. I believe it was Tuesday, February 4th or 5th, and generated a lot of buzz surrounding some of the really interesting bills that have been brought forth and proposed in the House. One in particular being this very popular, and we talked about it briefly last time I was on a little under a year ago, but kind of born, I think, from inspiration from a New Hampshire bill co-written by Greg Ferenstein, from my understanding, of the Reason Foundation, but kind of championed by Allison Hoots, who's one of my, I think, favorite legal minds in this space. I wouldn't call it a personal licensing bill. We don't have to do a full breakdown. Those who are listening, there's been some great coverage and talk of this bill. It's inspired a number of really awesome kind of copycat bills in Connecticut, which we'll get to because there's some really interesting stuff going on down there. But also a bill in Massachusetts. One of the 12 different psychedelic-related bills was filed. A recent New Mexico proposal that has generated, obviously, some serious steam within their legislature, was also modeled after the Allison Hoots, Greg Ferenstein model, if you will. And I think it makes sense, right? I'm really a big fan of that. I'm not a legal scholar. I'm not a lawyer. I am not a policy expert either. I'm just a humble scribbler trying to, transcribe what's going on out there. But I think that it is a proposal that will be looked back on by legal scholars and policy experts, hopefully, in 10, 20, 30 years, as a really interesting turning point for the argument of, especially when it comes to cognitive liberty, and how we provide safeguards to people to expand and explore their own consciousness, whether it's recreationally or in search of healing, and how public education public education funded by the state in that context can be done efficiently, effectively, and at not a major burden to taxpayers, which I know is obviously a conversation in the national discourse that's all the rage right now. And I think there's been no shortage of misleading and frustrating information that's come out that are telling half truth about what's getting cut and what's not. That's something we'll get into, obviously, with the DOI, DOC update, which I think is a good segue, actually, because one of New Yorkers for Mental Health Alternatives, finest in terms of one of their legal minds associated with the organization is Robert Rush, based in Western New York, who is also co-counsel for the SSDP Ramos legal team. I know you've interviewed Hamilton a couple of times about this, and was honored to be down there with him for their week and a half long hearing of the DEA last November, which has been obviously a continued saga with a lot of the administrative changes coming. There's been obviously no shortage of bullishness on and boorishness, if you will, on both sides about what RFK Jr.'s reign at the HHS might bring. But I think it is really important to note the most recent developments at the DEA, where the newly appointed administrator is about as staunch of a prohibitionist as you can get. So that, coupled with speculation from a number of folks I've spoken to about, what regulatory freeze executive orders might bring for the scheduling process, it was important to me to reach out directly to Robert Rush earlier today just to get some clarification. And from his perspective, it seems like obviously we're, very much in uncharted territory with both this administrative change and a hot and cold perspective on in various areas of this new administration on what drug policy reform efforts might look like. But that they are still awaiting, next guidance and next steps. I think it's important to note from my vantage point. I know, like I said earlier, you had some great conversations with Hamilton about it. It was a thrill to be able to meet him and spend time with him down there. He and I were the only two journalists that were there every day. I ended up kind of being embedded with the SSDP legal team and getting an inside view of their operation, which was profound. And so this is a saga that's really interested me, both from a personal really being in it, but also it's so undercovered, and the implications of what DOI or DOC being scheduled, whether it's class one, or even a couple of steps below, theoretically, I have no idea where this will go, to be super clear, but would rapidly, in my opinion, consolidate and corporatize and monopolize a lot of serotonin related research, in the biopharma space. And that is one of the downstream 10, 15-year costs of this potential move that is really important to keep an eye on, and to consider that I don't think has been given enough tread within broader media coverage of this. There's been some really great media coverage of the DOI DOC sagas. I've been fortunate enough to cover it a little bit for Filter and for Psychedelic Alpha, and there's been some other really great coverage from reporters in the psychedelic space. But the disconnect between the importance of this, the first psychedelic, I think the tryptamine's case never made it to a full hearing, from my understanding, when they tried to schedule tryptamine. So this was the first psychedelic specific related scheduling hearing since 1986. A historic moment, and none, going in on the inside, and as Hamilton talked about, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but from my vantage point, the case was so weak on the DEA's part that it really was worth taking a lot closer look at, especially now in the face of all of these conversations surrounding administrative bloat. So I know that I'm rambling a lot, as you know, I love to riff, but I think beyond those two developments, there's no shortage of interesting evolutions going on in the psychedelic policy space. I want to shout out the Indiana Psychedelic Society, who I've had some preliminary messaging with, but last night they hosted a screening of Music for Mushrooms, East Forest, documentary that I was fortunate enough, side note and not a plug, unaffiliated with the crew related to that movie, but I thought it was great. And I was fortunate enough to speak on a panel about psychedelic policy after a showing here in Massachusetts, just outside of Boston. So I found it really interesting that they were doing this hearing, the showing of this, because in general, Indiana is not somewhere that you would think psychedelic policy might be a hot topic. But from what I've seen from their recap of the event this morning on Instagram, there was an interesting crowd. There were, former Republican legislators there talking, speaking on behalf of the benefits and noting that it's pretty profound, that there's this, strong movement there. It's a research funding bill that could lead to a pilot program, for, potential like veteran exception, kind of care like we've seen crop up in Missouri and other states. But there have been, there was a funding bill, an appropriations bill filed by two Republicans earlier this year, that would allocate $600,000 towards the initial study. They've already partnered with Indiana University for that research. So all it would require is basically the appropriations bill was a formality, and I would expect that it is signed into law based on, what I looked into, for my reporting of that bill for psychedelic alpha. But even beyond
Let's
that,
jump in a little deeper on Indiana real quick.
yes.
So I think the biggest psychedelic news ever out of Indiana was related to the nurse who was busted for growing microdoses for her mental health and
Hmm.
potentially put her custody with her child at risk by doing this. And I think this set up a lot of attention on the psychedelic topic.
Yeah.
Um, that was a precursor to this is my guess, because yes, we need science, we need to understand better what's going on. um do we know what groups were behind the Indiana movement particularly?
I'm not I'm not aware in particular of which groups were directly involved with the outreach to to those two Republican state lawmakers in Indiana that brought forth this measure last year. I have heard chatter that some of the same old groups involved in previous statewide measures are involved, namely New Approach PAC. I don't know to what degree they're actively involved, but I have heard some chatter in the wind that they might be. I think that's expected, right? The broader measure that they brought forth here in Massachusetts that was previously successful in Colorado, failed pretty spectacularly, just both by the numbers and by the dollars and dimes wise and polling numbers wise. So you would expect, especially based on their rhetoric, in the press surrounding, decrim and or home grow being, the reason that that failed. And I think it's more complicated than that. We can dig into that a little bit, though. There's some things I will preemptively say I can't speak on due to ongoing, reporting. Um, but I think, it does make sense that they might be shifting towards, a more conservative, minded state. I know that they've been at least loosely involved in Arizona. And when I'd interviewed David Bronner himself, for an article I wrote for Double Blind last year, he indicated that there had been interest in some sort of, moving back towards, in terms of what's next, some sort of conservative state. Yeah. Uh, so I think, even beyond Indiana, bringing it back out broadly very quickly. 38 bills filed across 14 states in January alone. An unprecedented explosion of psychedelic related policy brought forth across, every single, angle of the aisle that you might possibly find across the political spectrum. And yet, obviously there's so much going on on an international scale. In terms of the federal level, and a lot of uproar about and agreement from some folks as to what's going on with spending cuts, et cetera, uh, and rhetoric from the White House. But this is an incredible story that is part of an emerging trend, even in spite of some of the setbacks with federal approval in the medicalization route. That it really speaks to the testament of the diversity and uniquity of the political arm of the psychedelic renaissance that I'm really hoping people can latch on to, and view as a sign that there is common ground, and that so much of that common ground, interestingly enough, is rooted in an anti-establishment sentiment that I think it should be closely studied, and I hope to continue to be able to.
Mm, hmm. Yeah, the the research is so needed, and I think this is one of the points. Circling back to the DC problem, I see Robert Rausch actually is watching on LinkedIn. Thanks for being here, Robert. Love to have you on the show again in the near future to talk more about this stuff. But yeah, what I didn't know, Jack, was that this molecule, these sets of molecules, are really important to serotonin researchers, and the
Yeah,
idea that we need more restriction on a drug that's barely ever been seen in the black markets, like there's
totally.
no real history of use in the underground, um, making it illegal, like it seems like it's bureaucrats just trying to make something happen, to say, oh look, I did something this year, promotion
Yeah,
please. But like to your point earlier, the work sounded really sloppy, and this was critiques from Hamilton that have been covered on the show extensively in the past. Like Hamilton Morris, like I'm just in awe of his work. His journalism is unbelievable, and I can only aspire to be maybe 5% of what he does. But his coverage was spectacular, and he
it's hard to
he
keep
made
up.
this
I'll be honest.
paranoid, like not paranoid point, And he kind of said, like, I don't usually make this kind of point, but it looks as though that there is an element inside the government that's trying to literally suppress research around psychedelic drugs. And this
and
particular
consolidate it.
case made that point. Yeah, what do you think there?
Well, I think, there's a number of different ways to look at it. There is certainly the directly nefarious or insidious, the idea of suppression of research due to a suppression on the idea of expansion or exploration of one's consciousness and what that might bring for societal evolution. I think that, ideologically with some folks within that world, that might be true. I have no way of knowing. I have not spoken to folks at the DEA, but I think that there might be merit to that in a broader ideological sense. At the same time, I think you look at it in terms of the shifting tides, budgetary wise, across the federal government. A lot of different, or, I saw Pete Hegseth, who I'm not a fan of, but, said recently as the new Department of, Secretary General, Director of Department of Defense or whatever, Secretary of Defense to get my, exact terms right. Uh, Said that they're looking to slash potentially 50% of the Pentagon's budget. I don't think that's going to happen. I remain incredibly doubtful. It's one of the few things that most Americans think we should expand. Weirdly enough, is defense spending. But nonetheless, the idea that anybody is up for investigation or a deeper dive into how they're really spending their money leaves an organization like the DEA or any law enforcement agency that no longer has the kind of control they have over cannabis and certain substances that are really, up for debate. Specifically, I think cannabis moving to Schedule 3 or potentially in the long run being descheduled, or decriminalized at the federal level, leaves a huge hole in the DEA's budget. And I think that there is incentive to try to find ways to justify that budget. And that goes beyond just like we want, the money so that we can have control. It goes to like justifying pension funds and, salaries of secretaries of, certain executives and, upkeeping of that gaudy and wildly misinformation riddled museum that I don't know if you've spoken with Hamilton about, but is on the first floor of the DEA right below the courthouse, which in itself, the entire thing is so weird, right? Like we're in this, tiny little courtroom on the second floor of the DEA's like headquarters, tucked away in Arlington, Virginia, and this massive conversation is happening, this massive legal fight, and it's this, not SSDP is a long established organization that has a great track record in this space. Their track record of placing leadership, into larger roles beyond their organization is pretty legendary and I think worth heralding. At the same time, the budget that SSDP, and Robert Rush and his, client, Dr. Raul Ramos at UC Berkeley are working with comparative to the DEA is nothing. It's a skin scrape budget, right? We're scraping nickels and dimes to get there. And yet they put forth, a something out of a John Grisham novel to be incredibly cliche with it. It was this really, truly, it felt like a David versus Goliath, the perfect shot. And I will give credit to DEA Administrative Judge Paul Sofing, who I found, from my own observation, to be a fair and decent and clearly non-biased judge, who was genuinely willing to give, real consideration to both sides of this. And I can't speculate, again, as I am not an attorney, and I'm not a legal scholar or expert by any means, as to what might come. I think it's worth noting that there have been some changes as of last year to how the DEA administrator is, how that's interpreted as to how they, make the final ruling. In the past, and in 1986, as very well, Joe, and many folks who are listening, watching, know, the DEA administrator could go completely against what the judge's ruling was after the hearing, and that is what happened in how MDMA and a number of other psychedelics came to be class 1 against the administrative judge who oversaw those legendary, Lester Grinspoon. Shout out Dr. Lester Grinspoon, a true American hero. But things have changed, right? So even though we do have this incredibly, prohibitionist DEA administrator, I don't not qualified to get into the judicial theory of it all, but it is worth noting that they have to go with what is deemed the best interpretation of the statute, and whether that ultimately rests on Judge Sofing or the DEA administrator's final call, I think is not something that I'm capable of speculating to, but really could change the game, because the precedent that it could set too as well, right? Like you could make the case, if there is no evidence of diversion, if there is no evidence of serious abuse based on this new statute set by the DOI DOC standards, that psilocybin could be given a real look at. for rescheduling of some kind, or that, if that definition within the federal court system changes forevermore, or at least from that day forward until some other precedent is set. I just, it's so undercovered and such a fascinating story. And I think my hope is that it can be something that we really elevate and amplify, in whatever comes next in the Trump administration for drug policy, because just from like to me, it's such a money grab to have control, to justify the budgetary, the oversight, to be able to, consolidate under DEA partner, pseudo partner organizations that are conducting research in this space and can afford these gaudy licensures. Uh, and the way that the DEA in court was trying to play it as if this was some simple process, and also the data was just such garbage. It was like laughably so. And I'm not a chemist. I'm not, I'm not a scientist. I'm not a legal scholar. But from my perspective, it just seemed so slim. And to hear again, to your point, Hamilton, who has, the brilliant, is a brilliant chemist in his own right, but also just a phenomenal storyteller. To have it be so clear from his perspective was very validating, and to be able to share that space and kind of learn, from that perspective and that vantage point was really great. And another voice I want to shout out that showed up later in the week was Jordan Rubin, who is a producer from MSNBC, from my understanding, or at least was. I'm not sure, where he is now. At the time he was last November, he might still be, but he wrote Bizarro, which dives deep into the absolute absurdity of the Federal Analogs Act, which I would encourage anybody and everybody ask Robert Rush or talk to Robert Rush or bring Robert Rush on your podcast to talk about this, because he is so well versed in this and has taught me an immense amount. But he was also in the mix and witnessing, in real time, just how slim their case was. And I want to speak for him, but it seemed very clear from all of our vantage points that the DEA was working with a faulty deck of cards, if you will.
So there
And
was
we're
this
trying to
thing that
play it.
happened in '86 that Sacha Shulgin was involved with, and the DEA tried to corner him um, into helping make drugs illegal that had never even been invented yet. And the idea is something substantially similar to something else, and that was like the clever phrasing that the feds came up with. And
Mhm.
Sasha, being an absolute genius, was able to dance around that forever, saying like that's not a
Brilliant.
meaningful phrase. Like, in if we're trying to be really specific and have really good legal definitions, that will not work. And
Which is
I think there's been a lot of progress on that since.
Yeah. And what's so interesting is the DEA was clearly trying to pass off DOI, like in their own arguments, were trying to say DOI, DOC are basically analogs, and of LSD, and though, the symptoms are nowhere near the same. We all know, anybody who knows anything about, what it is to actually, consume LSD and what that process feels like, it's completely different than what Shulgin describes, his own experiments and work with DOI and DOC has, and by also user reports. It's not a pleasant experience. I wouldn't take it. I'm not a veteran
Right.
psychonaut by any means, but I certainly wouldn't strive towards finding illicit DOI. It's not even illicit because it's federally unscheduled, so it's perfectly legal in research contexts.
Hmm.
So I think it's also, yeah, I mean, I think seeing the DEA try to make that case, but also clearly not be able to justify why a U.S. district attorney wouldn't bring forth the same case, because a U.S. district attorney would have much higher standards for what evidence of diversion and abuse and rampant illicit, recreational use leading to immense public health harms would look like in order to bring a case against, DOR, DOC in in that legal avenue. So not even be able to justify, by their own evidence, it was so laughably bad that it really was like something out of a John Grisham novel or something of the sort. Like I think it would run great as a Netflix special someday. To be completely honest, it's a fascinating story.
What do we know about the timeline for what might happen with this case going forward? Is there anything published yet?
So I am not clear, and after speaking with Robert, and I would defer to him, for further commentary, specifically because I want to speak for them. But it's very much a waiting game. I know that they've, I think, submitted their, post-hearing briefings earlier this year, and are awaiting, some sort of something. The timeline was pretty vague, from my understanding, after those post-hearing briefings were submitted when we left the DEA in November. I was there through the whole process, and I think, it doesn't look like the regulatory freezes that have been signed into law specific, specifically include those based on, my speaking with again with Robert Rush, who I defer to on this stuff as a legal expert, or working on this case, obviously. Um, so I am fascinated to see what comes next. It could be in total quagmire, and if that means it remains unscheduled, even if in limbo, then that could be great. Or hopefully we move forward with some sort of precedent being set in the not so distant future through the proceedings. It would be shocking to me if this prohibitionist minded new DA administrator didn't want to move forward with trying to schedule more drugs as illegal, because that's clearly his whole, that's part of his shtick. Yeah, which is an interesting kind of another segue to we mentioned a little bit of stuff going on in Connecticut that's very much of note. For those who aren't familiar, Connecticut's cannabis industry, and I won't dig too much into the cannabis stuff, but it is, a bit of a mess. It's an MSO, large company dominated. I think there's like 7 cannabis companies that control, most of the market share, if not all of the market share. And as a result, there's been a lot of scandals surrounding quality, product quality, et cetera. We've had some scandals here in Massachusetts regarding, moldy and yeast, riddled, products and testing standards being passed off, and no shortage of lawsuits. But cannabis system is particularly, twisted, both from my own experience, speaking with folks involved in the ground, but also, a lot of the folks involved with the Connecticut for Accessible Psychedelic Medicine have been on the front lines of the cannabis legalization process as well, as is the case with a lot of these movements, of course. And what's most really interesting, and hasn't really been covered, is that one, I mentioned earlier that the New York bill, the Allison Hoots Greg Ferenstein model, was something that was brought forth by Connecticut for accessible psychedelic medicine. And I got to give credit to Psychedelics Today. We hosted. You were gracious enough, Joe, after some initial technical difficulties. We hosted, a little panel about post question 4, what went wrong, what Connecticut can learn. And due to the technical difficulties that we ran into, there were actually that first night 2 or a number of state representatives, from my understanding, or the exact number, that were in attendance tuning in, and reached out to the Kaplan folks and brought forth this bill. So it's a testament to really being able to platform them and raise awareness around their efforts, but also what they have run into recently is, despite overwhelming support by their own, finding out from internal doc, you can foil out of, internal comms between representatives, in a way that you can't hear in Massachusetts. So they've gotten the hold of some internal comms, even beyond their co-sponsors, that there's significant support for at least having a committee hearing about this bill. And yet the 2 committee chairs have basically just not returned anybody's phone calls or responded to anybody's emails about what's going on with this bill, despite pretty overwhelming support to at least talk about it. What's worth noting, it's even more curious, is that Connecticut State Attorney General William Tong was most recently the keynote speaker in Washington, D.C. at Smart Approaches to Marijuana's annual conference. For those who aren't familiar, many of you who are tuning into Psychedelics Today at this hour on a Friday probably are, but SAM is kind of intertwined with what's known as the Foundation for Drug Policy Solutions, both of which were founded by a man named Kevin Sabet, who is both a longtime White House drug policy advisor, but by a long documented history, a pretty misleading actor, I would say. I don't know the man personally. I know some folks who work at SAM. There are some nice people in that world that really believe what they believe, and I disagree with what they believe. But both from my personal experience dealing with some of the rhetoric that was spun by the No on 4 campaign here in Massachusetts, as well as the dealings that some of my, cannabis industry journalism predecessors here in the Bay State have had with the SAM FDPS Kevin Sabet apparatus, there's a pattern of manipulation of rhetoric to justify spending taxpayer dollars, allegedly on, certain anti-drug oriented, nonprofit work. So, and I know there's been some concerns with the rescheduling process over SAM and some other organizations linked to the FDPS and their involvement with the DEA's rhetoric and action in response to the rescheduling hearings. So I would encourage folks to really look into that and do your homework on SAM in general, because what does it say about, an attorney general who is working in this state that's actively trying to champion progressive, drug policy reforms, with a clear thought to mitigating public health harm risk with bringing forth this particular model. It's very innovative in that sense. It would be something that would make sense for the state to champion, especially in the face of all their issues with the cannabis industry. And yet they can't even get a phone call back.
Hmm.
It's just icky, to put a, a juvenile phrase, vocabulary word on it. But yeah, I think that, we've seen, similar twistedness, across this space. I have a lot of, work coming on what really went down with question four, that I think that, donors and adversaries and advocates alike will all be very interested in reading, about, campaign rhetoric and strategy, and who was really running the show. A lot of it is public info. But I think one of the most curious things that I really think is worth drawing on, because he's recently reemerged, and I'm not going to give more than 120 seconds of this, is the prevalence, or at least persistence, of a notoriously bad faith actor in the grassroots space. What is, at this point, one of the worst kept secrets in psychedelic advocacy for the last half decade is that an individual named James Davis, founder of Base Daters for Natural Medicine, is both not a reliable narrator, but also, pretty damaging and disruptive figure for the health of the movement. And I would encourage folks beyond the end of that sentence just to go look back and really look into my reporting, and ask yourselves, why didn't I see these stories in some of the larger outlets across, the Massachusetts media in the run up to the election? Uh, and I would say both stay tuned, but also that there were a number of attempts to make this story known to reporters, at major outlets, and quite frankly, I was disappointed in meeting some of, you know, the folks from, heroes, so to speak, journalistically outlets like the Boston Globe and Boston Herald, and their unwillingness to engage, with a pretty compelling and pretty damning, and pretty landscape shifting story for the movement, and allegedly, some pretty criminal acts, potentially, being involved with that, financially, etc. And I think it's worth noting that I found all of this, in 15 minutes and 15, less than 10 phone calls for the most part. It wasn't hard to find. It wasn't hard to sniff out that this guy wasn't who he said he was in many ways in terms of action and behavior, and rhetoric not lining up at bare minimum, right? So the, you know, disappointment in witnessing that inadequacy of supposedly gold standard journalistic institutions here in the Northeast, as well as the pretty bad faith, action and promotion of certain, academics, in this space of, this particular bad actor for the sake of, advancing their own beef. Was I never thought, I'd find myself in a position where I was, you know, having this conversation with you about, folks that platform somebody who is so willingly, and glaringly not acting in good faith themselves. But to digress, that is really what led to, from my perspective, along with just a general passion for independent media for a long time now, to spearhead, again with your, guidance and collaboration as well, Joe, the formation, and along with a number of others I'd love to be able to shout out, but the creation of, the coming creation of the Psychedelic Writers Guild, um,
Yeah. Let's take a
which
quick pause here. Just anybody,
absolutely,
if you're watching, please throw in some comments, questions, and please, we want to address them. And yeah, I'm really excited about the Psychedelic Writers Guild, Jack, because there's, um, a reasonable amount of low quality writing on the space in psychedelics generally. And a lot of it is self-identifying as journalism, and really I think can't qualify as journalism because that would necessitate kind of following journalistic ethics and process, and it seems
mhm,
as though it's really more op-ed and really slanted. Like, isn't there something in journalism about like a you have to kind of cover with the same amount of words opposing sides and things along those lines? This is one of my favorite
yeah,
stories that Noam Chomsky would say when analyzing journalism. It's like, oh, cool, you gave one sentence, but 45 sentences to the other
yeah.
side. So, like, why aren't we calling these people out? Why? Yeah.
A perfect example of this, to be honest with you, just to give a real life example that's still published to this day and absolutely astounding to me, is that the Harvard Crimson ran an article, shortly before the election that, prominently quoted an individual, that has been credibly accused of, a lengthy pattern of misconduct, a whole running list of condemnations, calls for investigations for law enforcement by a prominent state legislator's office. Just, absolutely astounding, overwhelming evidence this individual is not credible. Gave him three, multiple quotes, sidled up right to the anti-psychiatry minded president of the Massachusetts Psychiatric Society, Dr. Nasir Gami, a like cartoonishly buffoonish figure in all of this in terms of when you really break down what that man believes to be a psychiatrist of his stature. Again, not a legal scholar, not a medical expert. Take a look at anybody's reactions to some of the things that guy said, and you'll find a variety of reactions that, yeah, just worth reading into. But at the same time, the Harvard Crimson never even contacted the Yes on Four campaign for comment. And to his credit, and a medical mind and scientific mind that I am a big fan of personally is Dr. Franklin King, associate director of MGH's Center for Psychedelics in the Brain, and just stood up in that moment and wrote an editorial to the Harvard Crimson, both as an alumni of Harvard Medical and a professor of psychiatry, at Harvard Medical School, and said, "What are we doing here? What are we doing here? It's absolutely outrageous. You wouldn't even ask. You wouldn't even ask for comment." And I would encourage folks to consider why that is, and some of the forces surrounding, certain perspectives on the legislation, here in Massachusetts and in other states, that might have certain issues, an incentive to platform, rhetoric advantageous to their position without being the face of said rhetoric themselves. And even in and we see, like, I spoke with, for example, USA Today. Here's another great example. What baffled me, and I think is going to be worth keeping an eye on my future reporting, as kind of a wink, wink, nudge, nudge, is the persistence of quotability of this individual, despite outlets clearly knowing, and they're being pretty easy to find, right? You'd think that this big bad, this big powerful, political consulting operation, and a new approach pack in their own right with a lot of money behind them, would have made a concerted effort to point out, hey, this guy's not credible. Why are you quoting him? He's been accused of all this crazy stuff. So worth noting right off the bat, as we talked about almost a year ago, they gave the guy 35 grand. So it probably doesn't look too good to say, oh, this guy could get 35 grand to. Turns out he's been, allegedly impersonating a veteran, and, allegedly, submitting false testimony to, state committees in this person's name, and all this just absolutely bonkers stuff. You know, Probably a bad look to their donors that they gave that guy 35 grand and let him run amok, putting up signs all over town with their money. But also, just the pulled punches on calling him out, is really, baffling. And it begs the question why. Even beyond that 35K and the PR move, like, this guy was getting quoted by USA Today, a month and a half before the election, and by the reporter who I contacted, and asked, were you aware? By their own admission, had no idea about the story. Again, one, like, not hard to find. Google the guy's name and the first two, and his organization, and you'll find the story. It's the first thing that comes up. But at the same time, like, how is, like, the first response after they contact the Question 4 campaign for an interview not to say, oh, by the way, like, you may have seen this person, like, just so he's been ragging us, he's not credible. How is that not the first thing that you do? And by the reporter's own admission, they had no idea. And this guy got 3 paragraphs at one point. They trimmed it down after I spoke with the reporter and kind of laid things out. And credit to that reporter. But, even Boston.com ran an article, 3 paragraphs to this guy. And I know for a fact that reporter was aware. I know for a fact of the allegations. And it begs the question, why? Convenient, to have a grassroots voice speaking out against a particularly progressive piece of legislation is a pretty good story. Click-worthy, gets the people going, if you will. But it's also just a blatant violation of journalistic integrity 101. And I'm not going to sit here and say that I'm well qualified to cast that judgment myself. I relay that based on, discussions with folks that I trust to make that judgment call and to provide that counsel for me to be able to say that. But I think that there was some willingness to platform for the sake of convenience of story. And what's interesting is that I've repeatedly offered, to provide my, full dossier on all the allegations, all the evidence I have, stuff I haven't publicly reported yet, to reporters at the Boston Globe for their review and potential use. I don't care about credit. This is an individual who wreaked havoc in this, in this space, and there were individuals who allowed that to proliferate. And if there are going to be successful movements in other states, this kind of thing, we have to take a closer look at how somebody fails upward into this space where they are this close, to being the face of a movement, despite years of destruction internally. And so I know I'm getting on my soapbox.
Do you think
I've
this was
burned the
just
cross several times.
incompetence or embarrassment? Was it like embarrassment because of incompetence or
I'm
laziness?
not able to speculate as to like the
Hmm.
the exact sentiments, but I think it was my judgment based on my interaction with all sides of the campaign was that it was a combination. Yeah, I don't think that they are worth the price tag from a donor perspective personally. Again, I'm not qualified to say what the price tag. I mean, the price tag's publicly available. It was a lot. It's a lot of money, a lot more than other campaigns had, a lot more spent on certain things than other campaigns had. To be clear, all of that was publicly available, but also just what they actually got from it. I haven't been provided a copy of the exit polling just yet, but I've been we've spoken about this previously. And we've spoken with folks who are aware of the exit polling. It's not great. They didn't reach nearly as many people as they purported to publicly. Um, and if you're donors and if you're, activists and advocates in other states, like Indiana, you got to be asking yourself, like, why would I, there isn't a track record here. The bills that were passed in Oregon and Colorado are wildly different and not so, I think Colorado is a very interesting case study that we need to continue to keep a monitor on. I know there's been some changes to at-home care, et cetera, that I'm not as well versed in as you are as a Colorado resident, but it's not the bill that voters voted on 2, 3 years ago, almost now, right? It's definitely changed. And there's a lot of complaints from all sides of the equation. So if you're looking for a better way forward, why would you go to the folks who haven't done that yet? And wasted a colossal amount of money in the process. Uh,
Hmm.
so
And this is
I
what I
don't.
saw in the Washington situation recently. Is there's a I believe Healing Advocacy Fund funded initiative in Washington that chose not to include conversations, as far as I understand it, from the
Reach.
coalition of small organizations who have been doing this work for years, which to me
Yeah.
seems like very explicitly anti-democratic. But maybe that's just what we're up to in America these days.
I
But
also
like,
just
I
want to.
don't. Mhm, go ahead.
I just want to shout out like the first of all, Reach Washington, great, phenomenal human beings. Have a really fascinating approach on this that I think could work for their state if given real consideration. And I haven't spoken with. I'm supposed to speak with John Dennis, who I want to shout as an Oregon resident, but one of the bright legal minds involved with Reach Washington leadership. Also, Lauren Faringa and Rachel Cervenak are two personal favorites of mine, just as human beings. Great people to look to in times like these for guidance and thought and input, etc. But yeah, like it's really disappointing if that's the case. I know we've spoke a little about this briefly. I haven't had a chance to catch up with them, but it does sound like there's something to that, and it goes, you know, it's a devolution, if you will. It's a regression, undoubtedly. There was, I think, to their credit, in conversations with some of the folks involved on the ground in Massachusetts, there was a concerted effort, at least initial intent, to do a little bit better in terms of grassroots involvement. They brought on two phenomenal grassroots advocates who I think are primed and had, a historic success in bringing forth 7 individual pieces of the 12 legislation earlier this year, a trio actually. Jamie Morey, Graham Moore, formerly of the S14 campaign, and CJ LeConte, who was, brilliant former West Point, cadet, etc., Army captain. They're now all working with an organization called Mass Healing that I think is worth keeping an eye on. And again, before the organization's even fully formed, they have 7 bills filed in an unprecedented move because that never happens after a ballot question fails so spectacularly. So in many ways, the incompetence, of the Question 4 campaign, uh, and the disruption and eventual kind of excommunication of this bad faith actor, entirely has led to a potential reset that I hope can be a model for other states, if they run into things like Washington seems to be running into. That said, what's so curious is that like I, I've spoken with folks out there and stressed the importance of working with, based on having gotten to know Reach Washington, really, try to elevate and amplify their work as folks to, look towards. And it's disappointing. There would be a clear moving away from that in, a seemingly misleading or completely in the dark kind of a way. And
Hmm.
again, we need to take a closer look at the institutions that are driving this blueprint. I think that a lot of the folks that are operating in these institutions aren't like these horrifically awful, evil, corporate-minded people. I think we need to decouple those things a little bit better in the days and months and years ahead, because in so many ways, these are institutions that have existed long before this policy issue came to the forefront. And I really don't think this policy issue fits those blueprints. So we need to be considering how we can adapt and adjust to fit a truly, wide-framed, fully populist perspective, into psychedelic policy reform and how that legislation is crafted. And I don't think that some of these organizations are designed to do that. I think they're designed to do the opposite.
A speculation we had, Jack, in one of the groups I'm working with about what's going on in Washington is it's a couple things. So, what is politically expedient? Like, what can happen now? And I think a lot of people are trying to, figure that out. What can we do immediately,
Mm.
as opposed to waiting 3 to 5 years for something that we actually really want? Let's just do the thing now, which I think it's an interesting thought, but I don't understand the why behind it. And then the other one is, yeah, like I guess it piles onto that. It's like because we know something can be done now and we can afford it, let's do it.
Yeah,
Despite inclusion. So
what
what's
that
going on
will
in
do.
Washington specifically is a bill that is for mental health only and for clinical, type stuff like in Colorado and Oregon only.
Mm.
So you have to go to a service center. You have to probably pay at least $1,000 to $2,000 for a session, which, the decrim model kind of makes it more accessible. Microdosing doesn't really fit in a
Doesn't
practical
really cut
sense
it.
in Oregon or Colorado. It radically excludes people with chronic pain conditions and headache conditions, not to mention other people with different disabilities or religious
Neuroinflammatory.
inclinations for access.
Yeah. Yeah, it's one of the things that I was so disappointed with some of the decision making in terms of partnerships. I would have loved to see, and I don't know what the conversations were, but like I love the cluster busters. It radically changed my view and informed me about the differences, in psilocybin dosage for folks struggling with cluster headaches and chronic pain disorders comparative to what we'll consider a psychedelic visual hallucinogen inducing dose. And I think that we have a unique opportunity in states like Washington to radically educate the public. That's, a very interesting political electorate, in terms of its diversity, very much like Oregon. It ranges pretty broadly in a way that I don't think folks here on the East Coast fully understand. So at least having
Hmm.
that conversation would have been really important. And I also, yeah, like I agree with you that this move towards hyper medicalization, um, in certain models, and that being the move that a lot of institutionalist minded politicos here in Massachusetts kind of oriented themselves towards, both rhetoric wise and their actual dealings with bills, a couple of bills that were filed, speaks to a lack of foresight as to what that will bring for afford, like folks spin the like, oh, affordability and access will get better, over the years as care becomes more widespread, et cetera, or like FDA approval and potential health insurance coverage down the line. I totally get that, but you're forgetting, that certain, like chronic pain won't probably be included in the first wave of FDA approved psychedelic pharmaceuticals. So you have all these access, through certain pathways, but certain folks that desperately need care. An example I really want to highlight, um, is actually, Mass Healing and Parents for Plant Medicine founder Jamie Morey. Her kids, struggle with a rare neuroinflammatory disorder, an autoimmune disorder called PANS Panda. That very well could have been actually induced by mold issues, which is a fascinating thing. I would encourage scientists all over the place to look into that because it's just fascinating. But after exhausting all options, including ketamine therapy, that after a grant ran out, they couldn't afford anymore. They found their way to psilocybin mushrooms, uh, and it provided relief like no other option. That this mother who would move, heaven and earth, to do anything for a kid, and who can't relate to that. And the fact that I witnessed, and many people witnessed, like an active suppression of that narrative from the Question for campaign entirely, telling folks not to talk
Hmm.
about decriminalization, telling folks not to talk about microdosing, the most Google search psychedelic related query of last year, of the last 5 years, probably microdosing and psychedelics, right? Like they're telling them not to talk about the things that actually bring more people into the conversation and radical, like Another great example of this that's, I did an interview with, grassroots campaign director in air quotes, and again, stay tuned. But it does not seem like they were active. Grassroots campaign director Emily Onoshek was actually operating in a campaign director role, by the campaign's own, admission at times, and by the scheduling. Again, more to come soon. But at the same time, I conducted an interview. I think Emily's a very nice person, who is a compelling individual. Cannot speculate as to all of the things, right? But the interview that I conducted with her for an article I wrote for Double Blind last year, I was informed a couple of days before that, a representative from Dewey Square Group, who had been quoted often, a woman named Jennifer Manley, who's also a registered lobbyist, had, would be sitting in the babysit, basically. And that was the exact word used, was to babysit, right? And the first question that I asked, in this interview was, what is your role and responsibilities as the grassroots campaign director of the Question 4 campaign? And, less than, a sentence and a half in, Jennifer Manley from Dewey Square Group is interrupting and answering, essentially for the grassroots campaign director. And you got to wonder if that's happening in every interview that's being given to every outlet or something like that. How seriously are, media outlets in the greater Boston and New England area nationally going to take this campaign? Right? If the grassroots campaign director doesn't seem to be that, and it seems to be something less than, as well as an active suppression of the actual grassroots advocates they brought on. I spoke with, a reporter on election night, for a prominent local, news outlet, who told me that not only was she not aware up until my telling her that night of the stolen valor story at all, she also wasn't aware of who Jamie Morey or Graham Moore were. The actual grassroots advocates doing all the Democratic town outreach, Republicans organizing the town halls, bringing people into the fold, the actual, grassroots staffers on this operation, doing the kind of work that plenty of people would have jumped at to do for free, let alone, over six figures, which some of the folks at the higher end of the payroll, for the Question 4 campaign got paid, right? So, worth noting, kind of to finish that little anecdote about the double blind piece. I didn't run a single word from that interview in the double blind article because I wasn't interviewing Emily Onoschek. I was interviewing Dewey Square. It was disingenuous to quote that piece because I wasn't getting her actual perspective. I was getting the script, and I knew that. And I think we need to take a closer look at how grassroots organizations that are established and have community ties and relationships with legislators, what they're asking for on the way in the door to potential partnerships with larger money-minded organizations is really important. You have a blueprint of what hasn't worked. You have a blueprint of how these organizations that are coming in and trying to co-opt are failing spectacularly. You have agency in a way that previous populist movements over this century have not had before. That's why I think it's so fascinating. We have the opportunity to learn in real time, both from what's been going wrong so far, with more interest by the week in this subject, policy-wise, just in terms of the evidence, right? The research too, let alone the misgivings and the shortcomings of cannabis legalization in the United States on a state-by-state level so far, let alone what didn't work in the revolution of old.
So I want to bring this back to Psychedelics Writers Guild for the close here. So we got a bunch of time. So like a lot of time, in my opinion, was wasted on a story that, got beaten to death in the psychedelic space, and wasn't really journalism to begin with. And I'm talking about the Richard Jensen MAPS case. That story deserved to be told. It did not deserve the amount of attention it got. And I think people were very inappropriate in the way they worked that story, very much violating journalistic ethics regularly. So, there were so many stories that needed to be told, Jack, getting us to understand what's going on in the IP space, like what is the patent story actually?
Yeah.
And it was told so poorly. What is the FDA process, actually? And then, what does happen after legalization through FDA channels? How does that interact with the state models? All of these things were not reported on really well. And then, we still need people to dig into Psychedelic Science Funders Collaborative, HAF, Dewey Squared, and more. There's so much room for so many stories to be told here. and we squandered it complaining about each other and strengthening the drug war, when we really need to be fighting the drug war and doing good work together. What are we doing at the Psychedelic Writers Guild?
Yeah, so like I said, kind of my vision for this has both been born from witnessing kind of some of the inadequacy and what then I give credit to Dennis Walker for introducing me to the term, but kind of this parachute reporting, about policy related issues and who's really involved from a question for campaign standpoint, but also from a broader perspective of having come up in the independent journalism space covering cannabis and psychedelics and learning from reporters here in Boston. I want to shout out Boston Institute for Nonprofit Journalism co-founders, Jason Promise and Chris Ferrone, two absolute legends. Chris Ferrone's also the founder and editor-in-chief of Talking Joints Memo, where some of my earliest work has been published in partnership with Binge. And, to be able to learn from them, this craft without the institutionalist kind of spin from going that co-op with the Boston Globe, intern at the New York Times route. We're very much in the machine. I'm grateful for that because it's provided a steep learning curve, but an integrity driven one, which has been great. But through that, I've both also seen their model. For those unfamiliar, Binge has a statewide news outlet called Horizon Mass. I actually got my start as 18 months ago as like a 28-year-old, 27 at the time. Technically a student reporter. I was taking some classes, finishing the last little bit of my bachelor's degree, and got my start writing for Binge's, statewide outlet Horizon Mass, which both has, regular high quality, professional reporters, writing for it, but also is kind of built on this idea of, creating the next generation of hyper local or state and local minded student reporters. And a really fascinating initiative that Binge has, I know we're coming short on time here, so I'll wrap this part up, is MassWire, which is a free syndication service essentially for nonprofit and independent reporters. So like, for example, anything that I have published with the talking through Talking Joints Memo and with Binge, that at the bottom has like, this was published in part with Boston Super Nonprofit Journalism. Like if you're an independent or nonprofit news outlet looking to run some cool Q&As, you contact me, you can run all that stuff for free. In fact, the recent piece that I wrote about the 12 bills filed here in Massachusetts for Talking Joints Memo, shout out to Tom Angel from Marijuana Moment, because they picked that up and syndicated it, and got it a lot more coverage, which I am super grateful for. But the idea that you and I have talked a lot extensively behind, in certain circles, Joe, about this idea of the need for a network, because there are so many phenomenal outlets in this space. I'm a huge fan, to give a shout out to one of kind of the founding partners of Mary Carry-On, senior editor of Double Blind. I think she's brilliant and an essential voice in this space. I'm proud to call her a mentor. But this idea that we can all help each other do a little bit more without making it overly competitive. This idea that is, a psychedelic media alliance of sorts. This idea of a congregation of creators, writers, educators, harm reduction advocates, etc., putting out informational, next gen psychedelic and drug policy related discourse. We band together. We can do things that at least help mitigate some of the very worst of algorithmic discrimination. And also there are so many phenomenal creators running, smaller newsletters, and little Instagram accounts across this space. One I want to shout out is I'm ADHD as all get out, for those who can't tell already. And Neurodelics on Instagram, I think is awesome. Psychedelic Archives on Instagram. It's also fantastic, but like they're joining the game at a time when the algorithm has never been more discriminatory. And I'd love to be able to band together and help organizations like that, individual writers on Substack. I'd love to be able to pay for every single Substack premium I possibly can, but I can't. I'm an independent journalist, writing about psychedelics and drug policy. So the idea that the Guild is both a space that we can build community, but also build a better way in partnership with like-minded organizations, publications, and hopefully establish some sort of exchange for expanded programming, potentially funding for broader collaborative projects. I don't want to build a gaudy bureaucracy. I've seen how that doesn't work with the DEA and other places, obviously, having worked in the nonprofit world. So having something that everybody else is getting a little bit more out than they put in, and we're ultimately just elevating the quality and scope, but also being a hub for these larger outlets to come in and say, who are the writers? Who should I hire as a freelancer to work with our staff writer about this thing? They can get a co-byline. We'll give them some funding. It's a tax break for partner publications. Like, there's so many cool things we can do with it. And, to that point, to very much wrap it up, we're launching kind of a new series here in Boston that anybody in New England that's watching, I think will be really interesting. We've secured a really phenomenal location, art gallery space in a dispensary right across the street from Fenway Park to host regular forums and hopefully some guild summits or retreats for New England writers, in this space. We've talked about doing some summit stuff down the line. There's no shortage of virtual options. I'm coming out with more information in the next few weeks about, potential first meetings and et cetera, et cetera. So please stay tuned. I know we're at like 101 right now, so I will wrap it up. But I think that, yeah, to tie it back into your initial opening, like there is just so much phenomenal reporting that's being done in this space that deserves more shine. And I absolutely love the I saw Gene. I want to chime in here. One, Gene Lacey would love to talk to you all things Illinois Psychedelic Society. Huge fan of you guys. Let's talk for sure. Two, I think that there's a misconception that people are afraid of nuance. I think that institutions that exist right now in an MSM and legacy sense thrive off of the clickbait and the rage bait and the framing of headlines. I think there's truth to headlines driving web content or view content, etc. But like, here's a perfect example. Talking Joints memo is, the largest and really the only cannabis and psychedelics or drug related news outlet in New England, but it's also the fourth most trafficked, by the numbers internally, from my understanding, cannabis news outlet in the United States. 1 in 3 clicks, roughly for at least a period of time when, after I started writing about psychedelics for TJM, was on a psychedelics article. And I'm doing, Q&As about who these people really are. I'm doing, 3,000 word pieces on a regional minded, cannabis industry news site about grassroots misconduct, and people are eating it up. They might not want to read all 3,000 words, but I do think that people are clamoring for more nuance. And I do think that people are gravitating towards wanting to better understand this movement, very much so because so many of us are at least 1 or 2 degrees of separation away from many of the crises facing our society, that are deeply intertwined with the intersectional nature of the psychedelic renaissance. So,
Mhm.
From that, my hope is that, the writers in this space and creators in this space that are aware of that and trying to address that, like Neurodelics, can you tell me a more nuanced, angle on psychedelic education or edutainment, if you will, than creating, an Instagram account to, explore the intersection of psychedelics and neurodivergence? People are eating it up. It's just we have to find a way to expand and help these people do more without, succumbing to, groupthink or not, just building some sort of financial stability for it. I'd love an Apple News Plus style subscription to all of your incredible Substacks that you're still getting money out of it too, that guild members all get a little bit more from. Co-fundraising opportunities, collaborative reporting up the wazoo. Let's do it all. But I think that the demand is there. I think that this issue, for this issue in particular, it's there in a way that very few other issues are right now.
Mhm.
And I think that that is backed in, certain mesh points of web traffic and actual, reader and consumer demand for the content. But I love the fact that Anderson Cooper in 60 Minutes went down with the Royal Card Project Mexico. But to be blunt, they're playing catch up. That's a story that, dozens of us have covered in the last 5 years, and it's fantastic that it's getting coverage. I'm not in any way hating. I'm just saying that there is demand from people beyond that story for stories, that really, dig a little bit deeper into what's really going on. There's never been a time like right now in American politics where people are more concerned over the dollars and dimes and spending of government and bureaucracy themselves. Now, right now, arguably, this particular stretch of 2025 than ever before, we have an opportunity to address that and take a much closer look at the psychedelic schoolhouse rock of it all, if you will, how a bill becomes a law and how this
Mhm.
movement, becomes replicated across continents in the 25, 50, 75, century to come.
Right.
So anyways,
Yeah. And to
end of spiel.
further to further on Gene Lacey's question, keep it going in Illinois, but we
Yes.
have access to be able to stream and publish on, 7 plus platforms at one time. So I want to use this platform to live stream more. This stuff stays online forever, until they choose to delete it, whenever that is. But then,
Yeah.
could be a really long time. And so
Yeah.
we need to have these conversations. We need to explore the nuance, be willing to
Mhm.
be wrong, and be willing to engage with ideas that we think aren't fully mature yet. There's
Yeah.
so much left to dig into here. and we don't yet know what's right or wrong. We'll put it that way. But
Agreed.
that said, we have values as Americans that we want some sort of open democratic process, and we want to be informed about what's going on before it's implemented into law. Because once it's there, it's often a bit expensive to change,
Mhm.
if not impossible. And you know, I I hope the federal apparatus can get a little bit corrected so that the Supreme Court is the end of the buck stops there, as opposed
Mhm.
to the buck stopping with whoever the president is. That new recent executive order is a little alarming, but we need to be on guard and in conversations with each other. And the interactivity here is robust. So that's why I want to encourage people to interact here, because we can
Yeah,
put a little bit of color to your questions. Um,
absolutely.
and mhm.
Yeah, and to that point, yeah, I'd love to be able to talk to as many frontline grassroots advocates as there are. I've been lucky enough to get to know, hundreds across a number of states now at this point. And I want to put a face in this public policy issue. So, excited to explore the possibility of that, in some capacity in the days ahead, weeks ahead. But until then, Gene, keep up the great work. We're huge fans. Illinois is a fascinating case study. Shout out the Minnesota crew as well. Dr. Jessica Nielsen, brilliant mind, brilliant operator. And I think Alaska is a great one to keep an eye on as well. And I would also note Virginia just had as a closing thought as a native Virginian, Virginia just had a disappointing outcome for a reason for hope, breakthrough therapies bill that was back down there. I'd heard that it might be some political horse trading of sorts. I don't think that they advanced any of the bills, in this particular sphere past committee this year. So that, might be, a partial truth, if you will, or part of the narrative. But I do think it's worth noting that Virginia legislators have been the first to push back clearly against the Compass Pathways polymorph psilocybin bill. Shout out to Josh Hardman for picking up on that in last week's psychedelic alpha bulletin. But there was a Republican legislator who called it out. It's like, this is why are we giving this specific weird little carve out to Compass Pathways alone? It just seems goofy. And in Kansas, they moved forward and were seemingly in support. In other states, they've been in support of this specific carve out. And I think it's, again, a fascinating case study. Compass Pathways is opening up phase 2 or 3 of their
Are you
grand
talking about
plans.
this crystal polymorph thing that we're seeing in
Yeah,
Colorado? Do you have
yeah.
data that suggests that is coming from Compass Pathways? I've yet to see that.
I I know that it has been speculated.
Hmm.
I know that because I think the coverage in Virginia, and I think also interestingly, there was an article published in I was on talking. It was published locally in Kansas, but Talking Joints Memo picked it up last week. About a legislative hearing related to that proposal. There was specific mention in the Kansas coverage of how this specific thing was because Compass had patented this one particular version of crystal polymorph psilocybin. And again, like, it's perfectly legal for them to, like, they're not doing anything illegal, right? They've pitched this particular bill. They're also one of the only biopharmaceutical companies that's really invested millions of dollars into this particular area of synthetic psilocybin research and patented stuff. So they haven't monopolized it, right? But for other biopharmaceutical, psychedelic research, companies to divert millions of dollars of funding to try to play catch up, or millions of dollars of funding to lobbying for their own little patented stuff to be given similar carve outs, like, they have a huge advantage. And I think, again, it's a fascinating case study as to what this phase 2, phase 3 of what clearly is a long term vision for how they enter this space financially, is being conducted. These people
Hmm.
lay plans years in advance, decades in advance, even sometimes. We've seen that, right? So it's worth keeping an eye on. And as a native Virginian, I'm proud that they were the state that pushed back on it a little bit. I
Hmm.
don't know folks at Compass. I'm sure there's people there that mean well, but I'm not a fan of that bill, flat out.
Right, right. Having regulatory capture is what we would call that, and
Yeah,
some sort of like state level dominance for a few years. It doesn't seem like what the people want. Like they
yeah,
they want cheaper access to regulated and safe goods, not more
yeah,
regulation for certain companies to profit over others. So
yeah.
yeah,
As a
cool.
final closing point,
Hmm.
the other added layer of that I'd encourage folks to consider in the months ahead is, what are the secondary layers of profit for parties adjacent to this conversation, healthcare companies that get the exclusive contracts for pilot programs with state funding. How are they involved with certain political efforts, etc.? Stay tuned.
Exactly. Yeah. All right. Well, Jack, where can people find you online again?
You'd find me personally, I'm active on LinkedIn because it's the least algorithmically discriminatory. My name, is also just my Instagram and Twitter handles. Psychedelic States of America is a project that I'm working on. More to come soon. Bit of a Substack that I'm figuring out what to do with. Find me on Instagram, Twitter, Substack. We have a store with merch. Check it out. Support independent journalism. But Double Blind, Filter Magazine, Psychedelic Alpha, Psychedelics Today, hopefully in the near future, more and more. And Talking Joints Memo. Shout out Christopher Roan, my Obi-Wan.
Right on. All right, Jack. Until next time, thanks so much. Let's hang out backstage for a sec. Thank you all for tuning
Absolutely.
in, and we'll do it again soon. Bye bye.